Welcome to the Generous Business Owner Podcast, where business owners gain inspiration and encouragement to live a legacy, not just leave one. And now your hosts, Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. My name is Jeff Thomas, and we have a very special guest with us this week. His name is Josh Kwan. He is the president of The Gathering, which is a community of philanthropists. And that sounds very mysterious, but Josh will demystify this for us. Josh, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, Jeff.
Well, listen, I was just thinking as I was saying that Josh, he would be a candidate for the most interesting man in the world. You're going to hear his background and how he's kind of done all kinds of different careers, but there is a bit of a thread through it, and we're going to try to pull that thread today. You'll be definitely blessed by his story. But Josh, why don't we just start where we always do, with just kind of where you grew up, what your family was like, if there was a faith component or not. What was life like for Josh growing up?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for asking. I grew up with two younger brothers. They're twins, 18 months younger than me. So if you think of, picture in your mind, three little Asian American boys, almost all the same age. And we were about as nerdy as you can imagine. All the stereotypes you put on Asian Americans, we kind of fit the mold. We loved reading. We did non-contact sports because we had to protect our brains and our fingers from injury, because we were, we had two options. You had violin or piano. Did a lot of math, a lot of science, but we did it willingly because we enjoyed it. We loved it. So I grew up in an immigrant home. My parents came from Hong Kong and Canada, by way of Canada, to settle outside of Chicago because they were studying at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. So my mom did her undergrad there, got a master's there. My dad was doing an MDiv at that school. So raised in a household of believers. But my dad, early on, before I was born, had decided to stop going to church. My mom, prayer warrior, and sort of raised us in a home that, we would read the Bible every night. We would read the children's storybook Bible, and we couldn't get enough of it, right? Those cartoons and the little captions, and it was these amazing stories of people of faith, and that got me my first taste of scripture.
So, but it sounds like your dad came around. Is that true?
No,
or did he do the education and then he filtered off?
Yeah,
or did
that's
he
right.
filter off and then go do the education?
No, it's complicated, right? People's journeys are a little bit complicated. No, this is before I was born, and so he had this vision. He wanted to be, serve the church and serve God, and thought that maybe pastoring was the path to go. But before I was born, he decided that wasn't for him. And
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have that basic background, but it's a little complicated, right? It's not all in all the time, and like most stories, it's not that simple.
Right.
But all that studying as a kid kind of paid off to you. You went to some little school most people have heard of in Boston, I think, right?
Yeah, that's what most people who went to Harvard say. Oh yeah, I went to school out east, or
exactly. I know you're supposed to downplay it, but let's go ahead and throw it out there, because I think it speaks to this narrative of your sort of lifetime learning that happened. So it started very early and continued there, right? What did you study at Harvard?
I studied, so we called it government, but it was political science.
Okay.
I entered college thinking I was going to be pre-med, right? Okay. Like, so does almost every other Asian person. And I quickly discovered that, like, what I thought I was good at science and math, and then you get into a whole nother level of being good at science and math, and I wasn't anywhere close to that. What I found myself doing in the mornings as a student, I was like, I just read the newspaper every single day. In my dorm, we had every single newspaper. We had the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. and we had all the magazines, and I just would spend hours reading the news. And it was endlessly fascinating to me because it was like a window into cultures and countries that I never experienced. And the whole adage of like journalism is like the first cut of history. And I wanted to understand what makes people tick. How does the world work? Why are people motivated to make the decisions that they make? And it was way better than my organic chemistry textbook. So as I sort of thought about like what I wanted to do, I was like, well, this would be kind of an interesting role. Like what the people I was reading about, like how did this journalist have a chance to sit down with these world leaders and ask them questions and either hold their feet to the fire if they were in a position of authority, or you turn your lens on to some awful tragedy and you had a chance to tell the stories of people who were vulnerable, who were oppressed, who lacked something that we ought, as a society, as members of a church or followers of Jesus Christ, we ought to care about these people. And it seemed like journalists were in charge of telling these amazing stories. And I was like, what would that be like?
So I'm guessing that Harvard did not have a journalism school. History is probably as close as you could get, right? Or English, or
yeah, that's right. Like it's a little bit snobby like that, where we didn't have trade.
There's only 4 things you can major in. Okay,
it's a very liberal arts school.
Yeah, right. And then you go figure it out. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
We'll teach you how to think, and then off you go. So did you go directly into journalism professionally, or did you go to graduate school right away?
No, so one of the blessings of going to a place like Harvard was that you have incredibly smart people who do amazing things. So, like the student newspaper was published daily, and the people who I ended up sort of apprenticing under at the Harvard Crimson are now today the editors of the very top news publication. I learned
they're still doing it.
They're still doing it. The people who stuck with it, they are now, amazingly, they're running the newsrooms of today.
Exactly.
And so I was like, okay, I had no idea. So I didn't do this in high school. I show up at the student newspaper. It's like, hey,
put me to work.
Teach me, right? Yeah. And so I did. I was a student reporter. I found some summer jobs that were way out of my league. I decided in 1997, I was going to go to Hong Kong because my parents are from Hong Kong. It was the year of the handover where the British government was giving the colony of Hong Kong back to China. I was like, that sounds like a really cool thing to do. So I wrote to all these news organizations saying, hey, will you hire me to work for you in Hong Kong? And I had one news organization say yes. It was Newsweek,
right?
Which at the time was a really well-respected
it was
Newsweekly. And that I got hooked. And so I worked at Newsweek for a summer. I worked at the Wall Street Journal for a summer. I landed my first job out of college. I was like, what would be interesting? And this is, the late 90s, early 2000s. This is the .com boom. The first
that's true.
Boom. Amazing things were coming out of Silicon Valley. I was like, that's where I want to be. So I got my first job at the San Jose Mercury News, which billed itself as the newspaper of Silicon Valley. And that's where I got started.
So great. You have this sort of knack of, obviously, as we talked about before we started recording, the word curiosity, I think is a good theme for your life and in a thread here. But what strikes me already, even as you get your first real job out of college, is, hey, what's the most interesting thing happening in the world? I'm going to throw myself in the center of it and try to figure it out. I mean, that's really, I think that kind of defines you. This is super fun to kind of unpack this. And I think one of the things, like we were talking before, that we're trying to do in this podcast is sort of, we kind of feel like God puts this genius inside of everybody, not always genius academically, but just, they're good with people, or they know how to build a business, or they're good with money or giving, or anyway, there's a million different all kind of spiritual gifts, but also just sort of natural gifts that God gives us. And so this idea of curiosity, I think, is so interesting to kind of unpack and see how it goes through. Okay, so we do the .com boom and bust. So 99 to 04, right?
Yes.
So you see an epic. I mean, I remember I was at we took our business from Payne Weber Morgan Stanley in March 31st of 2000. So I know the dates of when it burst. I think the Nasdaq peaked at March
Yeah.
31st of 2000, somewhere in there. So you get to kind of see that
Mm.
whole thing, and then and then you move on, right? Because that's really not the hot thing. So maybe take us through the next transition.
Sure. Yes. So I ended up getting married, which is a monumental milestone.
Sure.
And my wife was doing her residency in Chicago, and I was like, "What do I do while she does her residency in Chicago?" And I ended up going through business school because that was an area of the world that I didn't really know too much about, and I felt like it'd be a very flexible degree and meet some very interesting people there. All of it was true, and I loved my time in business school. So I went to Northwestern for my MBA,
Go Cats.
and
Okay.
the
I'm a
yeah,
cat by tuition. Okay.
that's right. That's right.
That's
Yes. So yes, Northwestern purple, and it was a great experience. The master plan was to go back into the world of media, and having my journalism background, I was like, I'd love to figure out a way to make great quality journalism sustainable, financially sustainable. That was the master plan. At the time, like, you saw that what happened was like newspapers got wiped out,
yeah.
the digital revolution. And so there just weren't jobs in the world of
True.
journalism. At the time, I was like, I was hopefully more mature now, but I was very immature as a believer and as a newlywed. And I had this grand plan, and I wanted everybody to conform to my master plan of vocational achievement, success, and I was just chasing that because that was what I cared about. And I had to learn some hard lessons along the way. My poor mom was my poor wife first of all, and then but my mom had told me, if you want to live like a king, you have to treat your wife like a queen.
Mm.
And so I had a very unhappy queen who did not have the same kind of vision for life that I had. And so I said, well, if I give up my some vocational goals, I was like, God, to give me something, open a door for me that I would be excited to walk through. A very selfish kind of prayer, but God answered abundantly in an imaginative way I never had even thought about. He put in my path a person who at my mom's church just sort of reached out and said, hey, like, what are you interested in? What are you thinking about? And he'd said that he had come across a very interesting job description and thought I might be an interesting candidate. It turned out to be an entrepreneur in Houston. He's a believer, and he's a home builder, one of the largest privately held home building companies in the country. And he was looking to hire somebody to help him with his international giving. I was like, that sounds amazing. Just the chance to meet people in ministry, people who are running nonprofits, trying to solve the problem of poverty. How can we apply our talent, treasure, and time to solving global poverty at scale? I was like, great. The only problem is I don't have any qualifications to do that, right? And so this man, David Weekley, he's an incredible entrepreneur. I learned so much from him. And one of his gifts is that he sees potential in people, even if they don't have a track record yet. And he said, look, I'm going to take a chance on you. You don't have any of the standard qualifications, but he's like, I don't necessarily want somebody with standard qualifications. He's like, I'd like to work with someone who I could learn together alongside. And I said, okay, great. Like, asking questions is kind of my job.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was actually kind of a brilliant hire because he saw this curiosity in you, like we were talking earlier. I said, for any topic you might bring up, I probably have 3 questions and you probably have 100. So, I mean, but, and you and I were just talking about a friend in common, Daryl Heald.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just spent the last 24 hours with him with some clients. And, one of the things he tries to get these families to do is concentrate on one topic that sort of breaks their heart and then research it like crazy. And so, I mean, in that simple thing that you said, in that simple vignette where, and we've had David Weekley on this podcast. He was one of our early guests. People can go back, and Daryl Heald will be the week before this gets released. So you guys can hear him as well. But the thing I say, he already had a vision. Global poverty at scale. I mean, that just sort of flows out of your mouth, but most people can't express that simple of a vision and then hire somebody who really does that research. So actually it was, I think, kind of a brilliant hire. Did you enjoy that role?
It was life-changing. I
Yeah.
mean, it really was. It was life-changing for multiple reasons. I'd say one of them is a chance to sit alongside someone as gifted and brilliant, smart, and committed. So David walks the walk. He's like, okay, I'm going to do this. So I'm going to set aside the funds to do this. And then he sets aside his time.
Yeah.
So it's like a 50-50 model. It's like, okay, 50% of my time, 50% of my anything I take out of the business. And so he's like, if God's gifted me with a particular set of skills and way of thinking about the world, I should apply that with my generosity, philanthropy, and investing. And so I sort of picked up in sort of like through osmosis, David's way of seeing the world. And there's just an infinite way that God's designed each of us, right? So I sort of encourage each person to sort of see, like, how has God uniquely designed you?
Exactly.
And let that flourish in your giving, right? In how you run a company, and lean into that. You don't have to be a cookie cutter. There's only one path. And so David's particular ways, like, he loves things at scale, and he sees how the value of a life saved, and can you do it efficiently, economically, and then apply. If something's working in this one village, why not 5 villages? If it's working in one country, why not 10 countries, right? So, but he has to see the evidence first. Well, prove the model, prove that it works, and then let's ramp up scale. So that was our role. It's like, let's go spot those entrepreneurs who in another life could have built a home building company like David, but decided to apply their gifts to solving clean water or providing education or healthcare. And so that's what we did. We sort of scoured the world to try to find these entrepreneurs and then see how we can walk alongside them with a multitude of resources. So one of the early things that he said, okay, Josh, because you don't know what you're doing, go talk to people like Daryl and travel with him and ask him questions. And so I just did that. So Daryl's one of my early mentors. He sent me to the Gathering, this community that we talked about of Christian philanthropists. He's like, it's not that they have all the answers. They don't, but they are filled with people who are asking similar questions and are earnestly, sincerely trying to live out the Christian faith in the areas of their commitments. And so that's what I did. I went to the conference. I traveled with this group. I learned all these different paths of like, there are some people who are very analytical givers, and there are other people who are very spirit-driven givers, right? And both are wonderful ends of the spectrum. But it's really like, we have to learn from every spot along that spectrum. We have something to learn from each other.
Now, one of the places I think he sent you, or you found on your own, was Praxis along the way, right?
Sure, yeah. A friend and I started Praxis. Dave Blanchard was my co-founder and CEO of that organization. And God's gifted Dave Blanchard with an incredible gift of just being a natural born entrepreneur. I think of him as this incredible leader of our generation, incredibly gifted at starting things, and then also just a deep theologian. We talked about a trip that you're going to make soon to Italy, which is sort of like the world of enlightenment, medieval to enlightenment, this period of like this philosopher king, people who were in charge of, they had in positions of authority, but they also really valued education. And for me, Dave Blanchard represents that person who's like the entrepreneur theologian, the person who can build an amazing organization, but then also read deeply and think deeply and interpret scripture and apply it to our modern challenges. And that's what we wanted to do with Praxis. When we started this organization, oh gosh, it's more than 10 years ago now. It was, from my perspective, it was partly coming from what I was seeing with the David Weekley Family Foundation, as it was called at the time. Now it's called the Dovetail Impact Foundation. What we were seeing these entrepreneurs from both the secular world as well as the Christian world. And one of the things I noted was that sometimes we hear from entrepreneurs, especially those in Silicon Valley, they want to transform the world. They see a problem, they're going to fix it through technology sometimes, right? And yet some of our Christian brothers and sisters, like, where was that same massive vision and ambition? And sometimes they were left out of these conversations that and these opportunities to be mentored and to have access to capital and to be in peer groups. And because that's where Dave and I saw an opportunity, and when we built Praxis to say these entrepreneurs who are compelled by their faith, they needed to have this kind of resource to live out their faith through their venture.
So you were doing some of that concurrent with
Yes.
while you were working at the Weekly Foundation, right? And so
Yes.
where's the next kind of transition out of Weekly's foundation? Where did that take you?
Yeah. So we had shared this concept with David Weekly early on, and David said, "Sounds really, sounds great. I'd love to support you guys in doing this." So he gave me half of my time to work on it.
Oh, nice.
And he was like an early funder of Praxis, an early mentor to our fellows, and then Praxis sort of, thanks to the Lord and thanks to my co-founder Dave Blanchard, it took off. And so eventually went full time. Worked at Praxis for a couple of years, and we built out programs for nonprofit founders. We built a program for business founders, and then we tied it together. We started a program for people in college and young adults, and then reached out to people with capital, and then sort of started something called the Summit, which is sort of an event to bring people who are innovators and funders and entrepreneurs together. So that's a world of Praxis, and Dave continues to lead that. I eventually went back to the world of the gathering after Praxis, and it was a mutual friend of ours, Fred Smith, who founded the gathering, and he led it for decades. And when it's time for him to sort of step away from the gathering, he invited me to apply to run the organization, and it was a privilege to come back to the gathering, which was the place where that had sort of nurtured me and given me a chance to meet people who really invested in me professionally and personally. And so I never imagined walking in the doors at my first conference in 2007. Now, some years later, now leading the group.
Knowing nothing, and then kind of full circle, where you're seeing other people like you probably walk in kind of wide-eyed and
yes,
I need to learn these things. And so who are the kind of people who come to the gathering? What kind of families come? What do they expect to get out of it? And what are maybe the directions that you're starting to take it now?
Yeah, we're a collection of families, right, who are motivated, compelled by their Christian faith to just steward wisely, to steward effectively and faithfully. And the stewardship question is a lifelong pursuit. How do you responsibly care for these resources that God's entrusted to your care? And the stewardship is it's philanthropy. It's how do I marshal my time and my relationships towards the issues and causes that God's placed on my heart. And it's also a question of how do I do this within the context of marriage, sometimes with family, with kids, or it may be with extended family, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, multiple generations. What we find is that people come to our events and find relationship because it's hard to find peers who are asking similar questions.
Yeah,
who are blessed with these significant wealth, and then that also brings opportunity and burden. And so, how do you sometimes try to avoid the pitfalls, and then how do we celebrate together some of the opportunities it does bring to make transformation in a place or with an organization or with a leader? How do you do that without overstepping your bounds? And how do you do that sustainably? And how do you do that in relationship?
how many people, I mean, are usually, is it a membership or do they just sign up for the an annual conference? How many people are involved and in what format?
Mhm. Yeah, so our big tent event is an annual conference, and we have 350 adults who come to that, and we have another 135 kids, young people from age 3 to 18. And so it's very intergenerational, multi-generational experience. So we have some patriarchs and matriarchs who come, and then their kids and their grandkids and great grandkids even.
Wow.
And the idea is that we can experience this together. It's a bit of a choose your own adventure at the conference between breakout sessions and dinners and things. And we try to cover three main topics, let's say. So there's the how do you lead well? How do you lead yourself? How do you lead your family? Another bucket of sort of conversation would be around sort of the skills, the craft of stewardship. That's how do I make a great grant? How do I serve on a board? What's this thing about impact investing, right? So some of these tools of the trade. And then the third bucket would be around what's happening in the world, what's happening urgently, whether it's the war in Israel and Palestine, and how do we address these issues? These are complex, complicated, difficult topics. And then there may be topics that will play out in the next 50 years, 100 years, 300 years, things around the corner that, because we have the gift of time, maybe an eternal time horizon, Christian philanthropists have a different view, I think, and we can start addressing those early on. So we have some that are urgent emergencies, and then we have some that maybe what's the future of artificial intelligence? What's the future of space travel? And it'd be kind of neat to think about what how the church might think about that.
Yeah, I have a feeling the journalist in you likes those current event topics. Is that a fair guess?
I love it all, Jeff.
Yeah.
It's
Well, and you were talking about we were talking about artificial intelligence, and so maybe talk a little about that as an example of the recent event that you had, as an example of these sort of thematic things that you're doing. I think that was really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you think of the annual conference, multiple days, it's a bit of it's a buffet, right? You get to sample a lot of different topics. We take smaller groups of people on trips, and we call them explorations. So our most recent was the exploration on technology to Silicon Valley. And we looked at two specific issues. One is artificial intelligence, and the other is genetic engineering. And so when we go to a place, we say, who are the experts in their fields in these areas? And we want to approach it from looking at the theology of the issue, history, sociology, who are the leading thinkers and practitioners. And in this case, there were entrepreneurs and investors. There are some nonprofit leaders. There are some theologians who are thinking about the future of science and faith, or about artificial intelligence, and how might we, sort of reading scripture, understand how God thinks about scientific revolutions or technological advancements. We had the founders of the Bible Project with us, Tim Mackey and John Collins, give us a view into how, if you look at the Old Testament, and you look at what man built, and that's the first technology. In some ways, it was born out of sin, the establishment of cities. When Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, they had to start a city, and the city itself is a technology. It's built by humankind, and it could be a wonderful thing, but it could also be turned for evil, right? So the same way we think about technology, it could be a tool for flourishing, but it could also be used for harm. And I think Christians, we can't shy away from the tool of artificial intelligence. And so what are the institutions that need to be created? What are the current legacy institutions that need to be thinking and aware of these issues? And how might Christians with financial resources help either start or sustain or imagine this future with and for the church?
Love it. I love it. Well, I just think it's such a clear example. You were talking about trying to help other families and other entrepreneurs kind of in your career kind of uncover their genius, as we were talking about, those gifts that they have, and kind of lean into these topics that they're interested in, and pursue them. And so I just thank you for your use of your God-given intellect and curiosity to help others do that, and therefore build the kingdom. One thing, Josh, that we always try to do at the end of this podcast is, again, this is the Generous Business Owner podcast. So we have a lot of, there's all kinds of listeners, but, we think of these entrepreneurs maybe at Praxis and these kind of things that start these things. Maybe they get about 10 years into it. It's working. This is sort of our avatar on this podcast. And they're going, if this thing really takes off, I'm going to have some significant resources. And they start thinking about, how do I think through that? What do I do with those? As sort of a, most of our listeners are believers. And so, how do they think through that? So what would be just, you've met probably thousands of Christian entrepreneurs and just entrepreneurs, period. And you think a lot about impact, positive impact in the world. So, for somebody who's just starting to have some success, what would be just a practical tip you'd leave with them? Just one small step that they could take on this journey to maximize their sort of positive stewardship of the success that they sort of see coming.
That's a great question. There's for entrepreneurs who are business owners, they have a vehicle for impact in their company, right? There's a tremendous amount of good that you can do within your company, within your industry, and then in your community. Sort of think about the world that you live in. What could you do as a business owner that would light the way for your staff, for your team? Say, like, the way that Jeff is running his company is unlike any other company in this industry. And what would be those distinctives, right? Would be those distinctives in which you are applying the lessons in scripture that most resonate with you, and make it real for the people in your company. And then there's also, so not just how you treat your team and your employees, but how you do business within your sector. And what would it be? How would that be distinctive in your industry? So if there are certain core industry practices, like, this is how businesses are run in this field. Well, what would it look like because you are guided by biblical principles? How would your company do things differently in your industry? And then the third piece, which is more of like the outward, like, how do you serve your community? The mindset you take in serving your customers, you're constantly asking your customer, thinking if you were in your customer's shoes, what would serve them best, right? And so you have a set of practices that you undertake to better understand your customer needs. So if you take that same approach to a population in your community that you think is underserved or vulnerable or in need, that might be people who are without shelter, or that might be women coming out of abusive relationships. If you could apply that same kind of understanding, empathy, and understanding, like, what are those customer needs, and what's missing, what in the marketplace, and let's say that marketplace of services, is there a gap in the services that are being provided to people coming out of abusive relationships? Like, well, then go fit that need. That's the same way that you would think if you're looking at a customer segment. You're like, what is not existing in the marketplace that needs to exist? And that's my business opportunity. There's probably a similar mentality for, reaching people who are homeless, or young people who are aimless, or people who need help with education. So look at the marketplace of what existing services are available in your community, and what gaps might you and your company or your family or your church might be able to solve. Those are just maybe a couple of starting points.
I love it. I wrote down a couple of kind of key words in all caps as you were speaking. One was inward, kind of inside the business. Who are your constituents? It's the people that work at your company. How do you think about leading them? Also within the business are your customers, and maybe even your vendors, and the way you do business and the way you serve people also affects is affected by your worldview and your approach. And those are generous behaviors, frankly, because they're generally selfless. Like, how do you take care of employees? How do you make sure they have an amazing experience? How do you take care of customers? Make sure and then again, kind of back to our, we're channeling our inner Daryl Heald today, maybe. Shout out to Daryl of, pick that cause, I would say, that sort of breaks your heart, that then apply that sort of business skill that you have to, okay, just like you saw a gap in the market of whatever industry you're serving, what's the gap in that need in the world, and how might you fill it? Well, that's just an awesome thing for all of us to think about. So Josh, I just can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom and your journey with us today.
It's an honor to be on your podcast. Thank you for inviting me.
Hey, thanks everybody for joining us this week, and go to our website, www.generousbusinessowner.com. Sign up for our newsletter. You'll hear about episodes that we're releasing and so forth. And we're trying to build a bit of a community there, and follow us on social media and share these with your friends and leave your ratings and reviews. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Generous Business Owner Podcast with Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt. Make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can find the guest contact information in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode.